Fantastic. So I want to welcome Chris from Digital River. Chris Cosell is manages, I guess, compliances. Is that really the area that you're focused on, Chris?
Yeah, I'm one of 5 what we call compliance architects. We each have a subject matter area, but mine is audit and controls, so kind of proving that we do all of the other 4 areas.
Fair enough. Okay. And with no further ado, from me, I'm going to let you go ahead and take over.
Great. So first off, I wanted to say thanks. I really appreciate the opportunity. I'm sure it will come across that this is actually something I get a little excited about in a very nerdy way. So we've kind of talked about localizing the shopper experience, and I'll kind of walk through a little bit. So some quick background on me. Let me get to the right slide here. So prior to my existing role, I was actually a product manager in charge of compliance. And so my role was really how to integrate some of our compliance requirements into our products themselves. And the requirements from a legal or a regulatory framework really also speak quite a bit to the consumer's experience, and it sometimes runs a little bit counter to the frictionless checkout that everybody's really looking for, but it goes a long way towards improving the overall nature of their experience. So I'll kind of walk through a little bit about the approach that we take. The focus at Digital River is really on what we call an onshore advantage, and it's really a recognition that a cross-border approach will work, and it's always going to be your first step. But your global consumers are really going to expect a more frictionless and a more culturally normative experience, to be kind of fancy with the words. They're looking for the payment methods that they're familiar with. They're looking for the currencies that they prefer. They're looking for a lack of surprise in the checkout experience, and then kind of the final experience that they get right when they get their bill at the end, right, where their currency transaction fees or additional charges that pop up that they weren't expecting. And as I mentioned, these are really driven by consumer preferences and then the various laws and regulations. On this slide, I've got some statistics, and I won't really read them to you. The deck will be available, and you can read these as I speak. But really, localizing the checkout experience is about building everything that you need locally to the extent that you can. So going with a global acquirer, for example, may not give you all of the markets that you want to go after, or they may not give you all of the payment methods that you need to really satisfy the country that you're trying to reach. So for example,
Chris,
yeah, go ahead.
I'm sorry. Yeah, I need a definition. What's a global acquirer?
And so you can't see me using air quotes. There are a lot of companies that will tell you that they can process globally, and certainly some of them can, right? So Stripe or Braintree are companies that can process in a lot of different countries and even process in a lot of different currencies. But there are a lot of countries as well where what they're really doing is providing you the ability to transact a fairly universal payment method, such as credit cards, in a foreign country. But there are a lot of countries, and I highlight it later, Brazil, for example, culturally, they don't like credit cards. They're worried about credit card fraud. So a company that can provide you credit card processing in Brazil is still cutting out 70% of your target market.
Okay. Okay, I understand now.
Okay. So for an example, at Digital River, what we have is we have relationships with 26 different local acquirers. And then we do business with those acquirers through one of 9 different local entities. And then we're able to transact in 46 different currencies. So that really gives us the opportunity to provide the consumer with a truly local experience that gives them, it's managing and addressing their expectation. So
okay, so this is specific to saying, hey, I'm going to offer you the way you like to pay, not just credit cards.
Correct. And
okay.
and in the currency, and a big one too is the transactional currency. So the example I use on this a lot is, on more than one occasion, I have purchased something from PayPal without realizing I was buying from an international shopper. And so suddenly I'll get dinged from PayPal because there's the transaction, and then I've got my currency exchange fee associated with it. When you're dealing with a local acquirer, the consumer is not getting hit with that exchange fee. It's happening somewhere else, and it may be happening to you, but your goal is really to make sure that the consumer knows what they're getting into when they complete that transaction.
Oh, so this speaks to your comment about no surprises.
Yes, exactly.
Right. You don't want it like you thought you were paying €9.99, but all of a sudden, because of currency translation, like it actually works out to be more.
Yep.
Okay.
And there's some others that I'll show in some slides further on. Part of that is what's the transaction currency. Typically, that's really around is the price they saw when they submitted the order, what they're going to see on their payment statement. So we undertook a project at Digital River a couple of years ago that I headed up. We actually analyzed all of the code in our checkout pages. And we found over 180 things that we did that were either about addressing a compliance requirement or improving the localization experience. And this was everything from showing certain links in a footer only when certain countries are displayed, to making sure that we were appropriately listing the right selling entity or the doing business as in a particular country. So on the slide here, I've got an example. Are you offering the appropriate languages for that region or for that particular country? The one in the middle there's a law in Europe called unjustified geo-restriction. It's kind of this odd rule that says you can have a French store and an Italian store, and you can have different prices, but you can't prevent somebody from France shopping in your Italian store. And so a lot of companies then had to modify their little pop-ups where you're trying to drive a consumer to a localized experience, and yet at the same time, the law is saying that that's the consumer's choice and not yours. And so how do you comply with the law, give the consumer the best experience, and give them that sense of control over it?
Oh my gosh, that's complicated. Okay.
It is. And the outcome of this effort was we ended up publishing a document that we call our guidelines and best practices. So this is a living document. It's ever growing as we expand to support different geographies or different product lines. And it's really a country and regional compilation of all of the different requirements, as well as not just legal requirements, but what are your operating agreements with your payment methods? What do they require in terms of disclosures and notice and process flows? And so this is something that we have available for our clients to use as they go through the implementation. Digital River had been a hosted solution, and so what we had was those 180 items that we found were compliance or localization changes that we made 5, 7, 10 years ago, and nobody really remembered why we did them. We knew that we had to have them. And so that was really what we were doing, is looking at that and trying to figure out, do these still apply? Do we need to make changes? And then how do we help our clients do that now that they're hosting the checkout experience? So when we did this, we looked at 3 particular countries, and I'll walk through each of the 3 a little bit just to give an overview of what we go through. So one of them was Germany. So they're the 4th largest economy in the world. They're the largest economy in Europe. So you've really got to pay attention to Germany and what they're doing and what that expectation is. So when we're selling in Germany, we're actually selling from an Irish entity, but because both are part of the EU, that's easy for us to do. You don't have to have a local company in Germany. And then we adjust the payment methods so that they're appropriate for what Germany expects. So Germany takes part in what's called SEPA, the Single European Payments Agreement, which is their method of direct debit. Taxation is going to be local. That's not done regional. The preferred currency as well. Each country will have its own requirements around an invoice. In the United States, we think about a receipt as opposed to an invoice, but in Europe, and a lot of Asian countries as well, an invoice is a very specific legal document that's required. And then on each, yeah, go ahead.
I have a question, Chris. So I come from a company that's very performance oriented. And in terms of, like we look at every single metric, right? Drop off rates, right? In this case, cart abandon. And one of the questions that comes to mind is with all of these compliance things, right? That doesn't that get in the way of closing the sale?
It certainly can. And what you want to balance on the other side of that is what though is the downside, right? So you could have, for example, a higher close rate through your checkout process. But if that's resulting, for example, in chargebacks, that's the big thing that a lot of people pay attention to. Chargebacks in the payment industry is a huge cost. And so the more that you can eliminate chargebacks, you may not see the same close rate through the checkout process, but you'll see a lower operating cost to sell and deliver the product. And so you want to make sure when you are looking at those measurements that you are also kind of calculating what are some of the costs associated with improving that process. But there are some additional things that you can do, and we kind of walk through some of these a little bit. So, for example,
my question is how much. You mentioned something about consumer preference and so on. I mean, I would imagine some of this is compliance, some of this is what people expect anyways, right?
It is, and the two often go hand in hand. So consumers in Europe are considerably more oriented around protecting their privacy, and EU laws reflect that. In the US, we're considerably less concerned about our privacy, and US laws reflect that. You're starting to see a state-by-state approach, but overall, I think it still applies that in the US, we're less concerned with that than they are elsewhere in the country. And that again kind of gets to how you implement some of these things will really be based on the cultural experience. So an example I walk through a little bit further down, one of the requirements that we have of our clients that do discounted or free trials or free offers is what the law calls affirmative assent. And unfortunately, the law doesn't really define what that means. You might take that to mean a checkbox, right? So there we have that extra click in the checkout process that's tedious. You might also interpret that instead of having a separate checkbox, you might have a checkout button that clearly says, I accept the above terms and conditions, please process my payment. So you can eliminate the check, but still provide the notice to the consumer.
Okay, and all right, so I imagine, so you provide all those options and you provide the best practices to whoever uses.
Yes, yep, and it's part of the trick with this is that the laws are unfortunately not they're not written the way that we want software requirements to be written, and the governing bodies are not going to take a look at your website and say that's good, you can go with that, we won't come after you for that. And so everything's going to be a little bit of a calculated risk in terms of finding the right balance for you around being a really easy, smooth checkout process or a more restrictive checkout process that's kind of bulletproof from complaints or claims from consumers. And I argue that's kind of the beauty of businesses, is they're really built, they exist to take those risks and figure out where the lines are.
Gotcha. Um, I want to go back to the thing that all those statistics that you showed. So the difference in showing the right payment, I think that was the one. So 33% of online shoppers are likely to abandon a purchase if pricing is listed in USD only. And then consumers are satisfied. Okay, 71% of consumers are satisfied with available payment methods. Only 71%. Overall, that statistic's weird. So, in other words, you ran a survey where to come up with that stat?
Yeah, and these were not necessarily all part of these same surveys, right? So
Okay.
33% is specific to countries outside of the US. Obviously, people in the US would be very happy to have their purchase displayed in USD.
Yeah.
What those two slides actually really reflect is a very US centric approach to going global. The first time that I learned that PayPal was really the most preferred payment method in Europe, it didn't make any sense to me, right? I am so used to using a credit card and they have them there. Why would you not use them? And there's another slide further on where we talk about in Japan, there's an incredibly popular payment method. Culturally, in Japan, they prefer to pay in cash. And so there's a type of what we call a deferred payment method where they will complete the order, they'll get a ticket that they then go to a convenience store. The convenience store will scan that ticket, they'll pay the convenience store, and that will actually then initiate the transfer of funds. And it is a significant portion. Now, the trick will also be the extent to which your product, how is your product being used? If, for example, what you have is a video or music editing product, and if that's used by people that are semi-professional, they're going to be willing to go through a few more hoops because that product matters to them. It's related to a hobby, it's related to a side business or a primary business. If, on the other hand, what you sell is a zip utility or an antivirus software, there's a lot of them out there. And so to what extent is your consumer willing to incur the some of the non-local checkout experience?
Right.
And that's always going to be specific to, and that's where you'll have to consider your product as well.
Okay. All right, I'll let you keep going. I'm sorry, I took you off track.
There's a question here of when will you have local payment option for India?
Yep. And what was the question? I'm sorry. What is the?
When will you have the local payment option for India?
I would need to check with our payments team. I do not have that off the top of my head, but I can follow up.
Thank you. Got it.
I have a question. I've been a customer of Digital River for 16 years. So we're from Enigma Software, and how you doing? So one of the things that I would love to see is Brazil, because that's a big emerging market right now, and that was the only one thing that I was not able to do with you guys. Just so you know, I had to actually take that part off. I still have my Europe and North America with you guys, but I would love to see a little more improvement in Brazil.
Okay, I will pass that on. We do today support Brazil. It is a little bit more limited in what we can do there, and I've actually got a slide specifically around Brazil because it is a very complex place to do business. I've got the Brazil slide up here right now. 40% of Brazilian shoppers use Boleto. That's a local payment method. They don't like credit cards at all. There's kind of a big fear of fraud. There's also some really weird things around Brazil in terms of pricing. So a common thing, for example, with subscriptions, right, is $10 a month or $100 if you prepay for a year. In Brazil, a common payment method feature for the shopper is that they can complete your $100 purchase, but they only get billed for 4 $25 transactions. So they get essentially the discount that you are giving them for a 1-year rate, but they still get the benefit of paying over time. And that impacts your experience in terms of when you're getting that money as well. And that's all managed by the payment processor. So you don't even have control over the consumer's choice in choosing to pay over time, pay in installments. So what I'll do is I'm happy to follow up on the questions around Brazil. And do you know who your customer success manager is? If not, I can reach out and find out.
I'm here.
Oh, from Digital River? You talking about who's my rep in Digital River?
Yeah.
Tyler.
I'm here. Hello.
Oh, there.
You're there, Tyler. Yeah.
So this would be
Tyler, you're here?
internally. This would be a difference between our My Commerce product and our
Okay.
some of our enterprise solutions for the GC product.
Okay, Enigma's on My Commerce. So I know that there's some efforts to unify that, and we can follow up with you on that then.
Other than that, other than the Brazil situation, I mean, everything that you've been presenting, this is how we've been operating for 16 years. You know, one of the things that probably doesn't get through, and I'm not pitching for Digital River, I'm just telling you my experience. For all of my brethren who are here, is that, you know, I'm not dealing with that paying taxes and all the other localities. DR does all that stuff, you know. So because I'm actually addressing Bogdan, because it's not just the card conversion, it's those other costs of operating e-commerce globally that becomes a pain in the ass. So if I'm not dealing with chargeback resolutions, I'm not dealing with you know, dealing with all the different nexuses of all the different nation states and the European Union and all the American states, not to mention the compliance layer, that's really the value-added proposition for people like us.
I get it. Yeah, so yeah, the company I work with, we've always managed our own cart, and just to share that little story, and I've shared this with Alvin in the past, and where we've tested other markets, we know we can get everybody into the cart, right? We've been in all the languages that we want, in all the countries that we want, and we know that part of the funnel, if it's not identical, it might even be better in other countries in terms of metrics. But the minute they get to the cart, because our cart is US centric or English centric, it falls apart. Even when we've changed, but the thing we found was with the testing was, even if we localized or played with currency, the missing thing that we never were able to test was, well, wait a minute, maybe there's something about payment options, because we always just do exactly what you were talking about, Chris, is all we had was credit cards and PayPal, right? That should work everywhere. It does, but it doesn't mean that's what people want. And that's what we found. And what's got us kind of delaying our global launch on our side as a company.
I don't want to steal the percentage thunder here, but I'm just going to make a point, because I deal with global payments, is that, you know, I'll give you an example. In Europe, a lot of those debit cards in Europe are locked only to Europe. You know, we Americans tend to think that everybody's like us. So American credit cards are universal. You could use them anywhere. But that's not the case in a lot of countries. Like, you know, they have these electron cards in Europe, and some of them are locked to the actual country that you're in. You know what I mean? So one of the things that I've learned with dealing with DR is that they had the local intelligence on the different regions of the world that I operate. And Bogdan, between you and I operate a little more globally than you. You know what I mean?
Sure.
You know, so you know that. So if you're going to play global, you need somebody who's set up to play that type of situation in there, like that little technicality I just told you. So, and then you got alternative payment methods, like in Brazil. Yes, Boleto is the big one. Culturally, they prefer to pay per month rather than to prepay up front. and it's a little more complex than that with Brazil too, because you have to have like a local office there, and it gets into a whole nightmare. And I'm just I'm giving it back to you. I'm just throwing it back for the purpose of my brothers here.
No, I appreciate that. And I've got a slide, I think, at the end that people will find really helpful that I think summarizes really what you've just kind of highlighted. Some of the how things will get more complex the more you build local. And I think it kind of shows a nice break point when you want to consider, is it something you want to go alone or something that you want to bring in a partner for? What I've got here then coming up is just kind of walking through some of the considerations. These aren't necessarily hard and fast rules, but things that you want to think about as you're starting to go global. So on any of your pre-cart pages, right, this is really where you're starting off managing that consumer's experience. So do you have the right languages available? Do you have the right pricing and currency available? Are you displaying your taxes or not? Culturally, it's going to vary. In the US, it's expected that the price I see will be lower than the price I'm charged at checkout, right? Because of tax, and I'm in Minnesota, so we've got a little bit higher sales tax. In Europe, and this is one of the quirks that I love, in Europe, you'll price a product at 100 euros, but because VAT will vary, somebody who's actually paying 0% VAT will still pay 100 euros. So they're in essence paying more for the product than somebody with a 20% VAT, but the overall price is the same. At Digital River, we manage that by doing a reverse tax calculation so that everybody in Europe can see the same price. We can legally manage collecting the right amount of tax, and we don't have to kind of bug the consumer with making a lot of additional clicks to help us define where are they going to be, what's the tax rate going to be, those things. So there are different ways, like I said, of addressing. So Bogdan, your question around how do you improve that overall experience? Some of it is by making some calculated decisions that might come at your cost versus the consumer's. But if it improves that overall rate and it's a fairly low cost to do, that may be the right choice.
Makes sense.
Starting at the checkout with the shopping cart, this is really, at Digital River, when we talk about the checkout experience, this is really where it all starts. And this is where the emphasis starts to be placed on what has been communicated to the consumer about this order. So a common one, for example, with subscriptions is it clear that it's a subscription? Is it clear what the term is going to be? Especially if that's a trial, is it clear that there will be a renewal that will be at a different price? Again, this is kind of where you're going to show. So we clearly say includes VAT. So the European customer knows they're just going to get charged $99.01. No surprises at the end of that checkout process. And then depending on your order flow, you can certainly change this up. What I walk through in the next few slides is kind of a traditional shopping cart, billing information, kind of checkout process. But what are the appropriate payment methods? You may choose to order your payment methods based on your fees, right? So you might have a lower transaction cost with a payment method, and that's what you want to promote. A lot of companies have taken to moving PayPal to the top of the list, or even earlier in the checkout process, because the PayPal integration comes back to you with the billing information and if there's shipping information. So that saves the consumer from having to fill out more parts of that form in the checkout process. There's also some regulatory requirements. So in Sweden, they require that you display non-credit-based payment methods at the top. And that gets really tough when you're talking about, so they will distinguish between Visa credit card and Visa debit card. And so now you're showing your consumer, instead of just one Visa logo, now you've got to split that up and show them a Visa credit and a Visa debit, and they've got to choose the appropriate one. And then finally around subscription terms, especially with subscriptions with trials and introductory pricing, your subscription terms and how this checkout is displayed is really your best defense against any chargebacks. The banks have made it so easy for a consumer to simply call them and say, I'm disputing this charge. And oftentimes that's easier than them contacting you to say, I didn't mean to renew this.
Right.
And so now you've got an administrative cost to deal with that you'd rather not have to carry.
Right.
Finally, the kind of final steps on the checkout process, and I've thrown up a couple of more things here around payments. For example, I've got the Klarna. Swedish shoppers, they prefer to buy now, pay later. That's incredibly common. That's actually what drove the Swedish regulatory body to require non-credit methods be shown at the top. They're concerned about the rise in consumer debt, and they believe that displaying direct debit payment methods at the top will reduce that. And again, parts of what you want to make sure that you've got kind of done here, are you doing address standardization? That may impact your processing costs because address is often going to be used to help avoid fraud. Are your payment methods appropriate culturally, as well as are they being displayed appropriately so the consumer knows what they're getting into? A big part of this is you're going to have some consumers that are looking for you to demonstrate also that you're conscious about the security of their payment information. I've been doing this long enough that I remember the old, right, every checkout page had secured by VeriSign or some kind of third-party security logo there. Some people are still looking for that. Others are more comfortable with the idea that, well, it's my credit card. I can just call and close the card if I run into a problem.
Right.
So again, figuring out culturally what's the right norm for you and your audience. Is there a question?
So like, I just want to, I think you're getting to the end. My two big takeaways are, one, more payment, basically providing a payment type options, right? Like, to me, currency and localization is pretty obvious. You do, like everyone will think of doing that. But the aspect of providing the right payment type, you keep showing this throughout the slides, right? Alipay, Klarna, and then Boleto, preference for debit in other countries, all that
like
stuff.
Germany, they love debit.
That drives
They love debit over
conversions,
credit
right?
cards. Go ahead.
What's that?
I said in Germany, they love debit over credit card, for example.
Right, there you go. So that's really, that drives conversions, right? And at the end of the day, that improves your sales.
Yes.
Right. I mean, so that's a pretty important element, in my opinion. And then the other part about compliance that I keep hearing, I don't know that you're saying it out loud, but how I'm hearing it is, if you're compliant, you're reducing your chargebacks. And if that's something that's concerning to you, then that's sort of the why you want to be compliant.
Bogdan, I hate to cut in. I want to add also that credit card, they're not all created equal across regions. So,
Right.
For example, the way that certain European debit cards are, and let's say you try to buy a product that, let's say, is some merchant type of local merchant situation in the United States, it may not clear, So the other thing about DR, and I hate to speak for the DR guy, is that the fact that they have multiple regional gateways. So, for example, if you're a German who's going to use a German Electron debit card, it will work because, for example, Digital River owns Share
Because they're processing it there rather than, let's say, in the US, right?
Right. So they have the diversity of the gateways too, but just throwing it in there. But go ahead. Sorry.
No. That's great. I am always happier when it's a dialogue as opposed to a presentation.
So Chris, I got a question for you. I typed it up in the chat, but really is when you're showing all these different carts and you're talking about, hey, you need to take this into consideration.
Yeah.
the way we've tried to integrate with MyCommerce is we use your standard carts and we try and just configure them appropriately from whatever I can do on the administration menu. But when you tell us you need to take these things into consideration, are you basically saying we need to go build our own carts if we're going to succeed globally?
Yeah, that's a good question.
And just use your API, or did you solve these problems for us? Because I wish the second one is true.
So we've got two core offerings there for everybody here. There's MyCommerce, and then we've had our traditional system, Global Commerce. MyCommerce has been designed to be a faster implementation, a more plug-and-play solution for you to get up and running. And Tyler can speak a little bit more for people that want to follow up about MyCommerce. That speed and the simplicity, there is a cost to that, which is the extent to which you own the entire process. So we've undertaken an effort in the last year and a half where we are on our global commerce platform moving to what we call headless, which is really designed to solve the issue that Bogdan mentioned, right? Which is they want to own the cart and that checkout experience. So with our headless model, you own the entire process and you are only really initiating communication to process the order with Digital River when you've got all of the information necessary and it's just submit. We don't host all of that. It's all done through APIs, and then we do have a secure payment integration that allows you to leverage us and keep your PCI risk down. Excuse me. Which is right is going to be dependent on your business, your market, your volume, and how much of that work that you want to take on. Given where we're at, what I think kind of makes the most sense, we've touched on it a few times, and I don't know, Bogdan, if you would disagree. I kind of want to jump to the last slide because I think it walks through.
Yeah, no, go for it. I think we've heard everything loud and clear.
Yep. So this really.
So Bogdan, you're going to go global?
It's only a matter of time.
So this is really kind of meant to illustrate what I think we've all raised at multiple times during the last 45 minutes. Cross-border payments is pretty straightforward, and you can do that with any payment provider. They're going to be able to offer you some local currencies, some local pricing, some local payment methods. They're going to be able to do the reconciliation with you. They're going to be able to tie into your back-end systems, and you will see some uplift in revenue as you take what amounts to your existing checkout and your existing payment solution and just start to push that globally. But when you're using just a payment provider like Stripe or CyberSource, when you want to start to go local and truly provide a localized checkout experience, it's going to begin to get more difficult. And this is where you're going to have to choose to what extent are you going to take on the responsibility for these kind of last three levels of going global. So if you look, for example, at stage 3, that first step is, do you need to establish a legal selling entity in another country? That's going to give you the basis for taxation. It's also going to open you up to some compliance requirements and regulations, and even just the plain old overhead of, an annual filing to make sure that the entity stays valid and up and running. And so what you've heard a couple of times, one of the things that Digital River does, and there are other companies out there that offer something similar, is they'll take on some of the effort that's required in stages 3, 4, and 5. And one of the models that we do that is we take on the legal and the taxation complexity, but the hosting experience, you can still own yourself. But don't underestimate the complexity in doing that either. So when you do start to see these additional levels of localization, again, you're going to get a better uplift in sales. It is not without some additional cost. And so you want to make sure that you're doing each of these particular steps appropriately. So stage 4, you're actually now, instead of just sticking with your local, or rather your global acquirers, now you're dealing with local acquirers. What are the processors in that country or in that particular region that can really offer you the payment methods that you need, as well as any of the other features? So in Sweden, after they had passed that particular law about displaying the payment methods in a particular order, the way that they made that law, it was kind of weird. The merchant isn't required to display the payment methods in that order. Payment processors are required to require the merchant to display the payment methods in that order. So if you have a local acquirer, they actually implemented the solution, and you just needed to make sure that you were using their latest integration method and you were compliant. If you were not dealing with a local acquirer and you were dealing with a global acquirer, you would still need them to undertake that effort to display that on your own, because that's a local acquirer is offering that solution, a global one may not be. The thing as you go further into these levels of globalization as well, is you want to make sure that you've got the appropriate volume in the markets that you're targeting to warrant some of the effort. You're going to have an upfront investment cost to get up and running, and then you're going to have that kind of operating cost, the recurring overhead, and make sure that your volume is going to allow you to get profitable in that region in an appropriate amount of time for your business. One of the things that you heard mentioned was intelligent routing, for example, on the final level 5 there. If absolutely necessary, when PSD2 launched, one of the things that Digital River would have been able to do if we had needed to was route the credit card transaction out of Europe to a US-based company. And it would have changed the shopper's experience, but we would have been able to have proceeded with the sale. So that's really where having multiple payment processors and being able to route between them accordingly. But it does involve, again, quite a bit of effort to create that extra layer there that can do the routing and can do the integration with the additional payment methods.
Got it.
I'm going to jump back because there was a slide that we particularly, I think, wanted to show, which was around free and discounted trials.
Yeah.
So free and discounted trials really, the requirements to do this appropriately are really pushed by 2 things. The big one is Visa. And then it's also, there's a lot of consumer protection laws around this. And so what Digital River did is we really boiled this down to 4 core requirements when we're dealing with a discounted or a free trial. And to be clear, Visa doesn't distinguish between free and discounted, right? Their big thing is, if the shopper gets charged in month 2 an amount they weren't expecting, they're going to call and request a chargeback. Chargebacks cost Visa money, so they're going to push it onto you. Anything that is Visa's problem pretty quickly becomes the merchant's problem. And so you want to do everything that you can to reduce that. So it's what they call a clear and conspicuous disclosure of material terms. That doesn't necessarily mean it needs to be buried in legalese, right? So here we just make sure that the product name is appropriate, the price is clear for what's going to happen, or the renewal term. And it may be by as easy as kind of calling out on a page or in the confirmation email, this will renew at, and being very clear about that price. The other thing is it requires what's called affirmative assent to auto renewal and payment storage. So Visa separately requires not just that you're collecting this information, but that they are giving you permission to save it and use it for renewal. And so we actually have just one sentence at the bottom of our, what we call our auto renewal terms, where we call that out. You may store my payment method and you may use this to process subsequent orders. Third, Notice of renewal. So you need to re-include the material terms when you send the reminder that you're going to renew the product and at the regular price. And that's also then where you want to include the easy cancellation mechanism. And this is always the one that's tough, right? The easier it is to cancel, the bigger the risk to your revenue. And so you've got to figure out what's the appropriate cancellation. You've also got to consider if they don't cancel and instead they dispute the charge, you now have administrative costs to deal with that chargeback, right? Because somebody's going to get the inquiry from the payment provider and say, this consumer is challenging the charge. You've got to go find the transaction. You've got to respond. There's a cost to that. And it's kind of easy to forget because it's buried in the overhead. But it really does go to the overall profitability of your business. So.
Now, this is super useful. So I kind of want to touch back and look at the chat on Dennis's question. So is this all automatic? I go sign up and I put in my product and all these disclosures get auto created for me and I'm good to go? It's
not automatic, but there is a lot that's available to help and guide you through this. So with our new global commerce solution, where you are interacting with us through APIs, we are taking all of these notices. So I've got, for example, on this next slide, we kind of jumped over. In the EU, there's particular notices that you're required to show. And they vary by country and by region. And so it can get complex very quickly. Some companies will say, I'm just going to show everything all the time in Europe. Some countries will go more some companies will go more country by country. But we actually have a tool that makes the content that you need available so that you can, it's a JavaScript library, you can access that and it will, you know that the shopper is in Italy and it will say, great, here is the appropriate legal notice for the selling entity. Here is the appropriate link for right of cancellation of the order. Here is the appropriate link for the warranty provision for the terms of sale. And then you can choose to display that where you need and format it appropriately for your site.
All right, so with your API provides the core content that we need to decide where to place and how to place and so on. What about the easier BigCommerce side of things? You guys have all this stuff thought through, not just for compliance, but also for payment types based on geo, I guess? I don't know.
Yes. So with MyCommerce, the checkout process. With MyCommerce, the checkout process, it's there, it's built in. Your ability to change that is more limited. Your ability to change where it is, the look and the feel is more limited, but you are up and running much more quickly. You've got less heavy lifting on your end to get up and running. And so your speed to market is going to be dramatically improved as well.
All right, so if I want to do a test and I can try with MyCommerce, I'm thinking about my payment method focus here.
Sure.
Right, I'd be able to go try things out in Spain or France and see how things perform with the localized, with not just the localized, but the payment options being shown appropriately to our customers.
I can go ahead and jump in on that one, Chris. So this is Tyler Sonic speaking with MyCommerce. So yes, our MyCommerce cart, as Chris alluded to, it's you can change the look and feel through a theme manager. But as far as the customer experience, we're pretty much going to automate that cart to display localized language. The customer can also change language if they wanted to change from France to, or from French to German, or etc. Also, the payment methods available in the cart will also auto-generate depending on customer's currency or location. So if one payment method is not available in USD, if the customer changed their currency from USD to Euro, their payment methods would also recalibrate and display appropriate payment methods for that country and currency mix.
Interesting.
Bogdan, and I'm speaking as a customer here, okay? I'm going to tell you this. So again, 16 years for me. So you see the gentleman that's there, Tyler. So you also get your own dedicated rep. In the case of my commerce, I can't speak for GC because I never use GC. And, so it's not just the automation. You're paired with a rep that all he cares about in this life is your account, right? He's paired to the. By the way, Tyler, are you here?
Yeah, he just spoke.
Yes.
Oh, you're here. Okay, so that's my rep, just so you know. So just so you guys get to know it. And I known Tyler probably before he was growing facial hair. So I don't mean to put you on the spot, Tyler. Right? So and I'm sure, Tyler, are you also Dennis's rep?
No, I'm not, but I do watch Dennis's account. Yes.
Yeah. Okay. So Dennis has a rep dedicated for Dennis too, right?
I'm not exactly sure. Probably he does go through at least our standard kind of support channel.
Right.
I believe Dennis has more of probably a line at this point with our sales team who has been reaching out with him to onboard.
But he has a person that he knows. I mean, Dennis is here too, and a first name basis like you for anything that he wants to do when he's doing the integration. I'm assuming, just like I do with you, right? Yes, no, maybe. Never mind.
I go ahead and let Dennis answer that one. I'm not sure what he.
Yeah, let Dennis answer that. Dennis, you have a rep? We lost Dennis.
Dennis might have stepped away.
Oh, he's not there. Okay, never mind. Yeah.
All right,
So,
Chris, I'll let you keep going. We're by the way, we're on the 5-minute mark in terms of our time, so I want to make sure we.
No, that's fine. So I've hit the end of the slides, right? I'm at the lovely open it up for questions.
Okay, so anybody have questions on any of this? I know I feel like I've been monopolizing the questions. So I'll apologize.
Well, that's fine, but you've been covering questions probably a lot of us had, Bogdan. That was good.
Yes.
I saw Jordan write an interesting note.
And then Alvin, of course, filled in the entertainment in between, which is great.
So I have one
Jordan
question.
made an interesting comment about 3D something in Europe. Sounded like two-factor authentication for credit cards, I guess.
Yes. So there's something called the Second Payment Services Directive, and what that requires, a quick background on it. What it basically did was the law said your bank doesn't own your bank account information, you do. And so your bank has to let you do with it what you want. But then we're going to require banks to add layers of security to make sure that that doesn't get abused. And that layer of security in the checkout process is what's called 3D Secure. So this is 3-domain secure is the credit card industry standard. And what it really amounts to is a whole series of rules that dictate when the bank that issued the credit card needs to interrupt the checkout process and verify your identity. There was an incredibly limited capability, 3D Secure 1.0. It's come a long way. We're now at 3D Secure 2.2, I believe, which is a much more improved process. One of the advantages of the PSD, Second Payment Services Directive law, was that it really forced everybody to improve the experience. And so what you get when you check out with 3D Secure, you're verifying the shopper's identity. You're also reducing it. It ends up with a shift in the fraud risk. So if the consumer passes the 3D Secure identity challenge, you no longer own the risk of a fraudulent charge. Now that's actually the issuing bank that approved that transaction. So there's really some good advantages.
This ultimately helps with chargebacks.
It does, yes. Yep. It also helps if you're doing country, if you want to go into a country where there's particular risk of fraud, because this is that extra layer that allows you to verify the transaction when it's going through and shift that risk then to the issuing bank. So it's a tool. Go ahead.
I don't know if that was a question or just a sound.
If I guys can just make one comment, Georgie here, sorry. Thanks so much, Chris. So yeah, I mean, regarding the PSD2, we are seeing this from the first row, obviously, since January 1st. So the challenge there, I would say, is because you have so many countries with so many different banks in them, and each and every bank have kind of their own kind of set of authentication rules. So this whole identification or like a second 2FA that's taking place, it can be in the form of, you know, a text message, or you need to have that particular bank app and you have to have it installed to use it, or some of the banks might even call you, you know, over the phone. So it's kind of a mess thing, but I guess everything in Europe is, so just throwing out that comment there.
Yeah, that's the one thing I know about 3DS. From what I looked at it, was probably in 1.0 days. It seems like a very onerous process to get the customer, you know, through the purchase process.
Especially dealing with, you know, senior people. So yeah.
Yeah.
You know, and I think too, one of the important things in the rollout of 3DS specific to PSD2, right? It was a point in time. And a lot of people, you know, and I did this at first too, you're thinking about what's the impact going to be on my overall shopping process, right? I'm going to expect to see a hit in my close rate on my checkouts. But you have to remind yourself, it's going to be occurring on every site. So it's not that a consumer is going to be able to compare your checkout process to someone else's. Everybody's going to have to comply.
Right. But we're just not there yet, right?
Well, there are still some places that don't support it, but the requirement is for the banks to implement it. So it's not that a particular merchant is choosing not to do it. The problem is that a bank is behind the times, and there's some penalties if they're not up and running quickly enough. So there's definitely there is very good incentive for everybody to get compliant with it. The other thing is,
does this kind of mean that we should all expect a drop in conversion rate as 3DS gets adopted globally?
Yes.
Yes.
Let's not even play that game. At first, yes, and over time, as become the norm in Europe, it may normalize itself, but you will have an initial hit.
Mm-hmm. And that was really
that's interesting.
Yeah, I think everybody's focused on that initial hit, but because it's going to be every merchant and it's going to be every European country, right? It becomes normalized and it stands out less.
Fair enough. This is interesting. That's actually a good forward-looking thing. We need to go. Let's start thinking about looking at. Now, is that purely European, or is that going to make its way down to the U.S.?
So 3D Secure is a tool, and you can implement that anywhere that your payment provider will support it.
Sure.
Its use in Europe is specific to satisfy the Second Payment Services Directive. So that's where it's required because of a banking regulation, but you may also require it in a particular country with a high fraud risk.
Got it.
Chris, I think what you may not understand is, like, you know, how onerous that process is, because you go to the card.
I do. I've seen it.
You've seen it, okay? Because I just want to make sure that you understand that you're gonna get an email, and then you gotta validate the email, and so it's a lot of stuff.
I will share with you. We were filling in with jokes. It's not a joke, but I do have an amusing story, which was right after PSD2 was supposed to go live the first time. A friend of mine was traveling in Europe, and they went to process a credit card at their hotel, and the bank prompted them with 3D Secure. The problem was that the phone number that the bank had on file was for a job she was no longer at, and an email address that was no longer valid. And because of the time difference, she couldn't reach the bank.
So she couldn't check into her hotel or check out?
Yeah.
Well, then she didn't have to pay. Hey, but she didn't have to pay. That's like plus.
The advantage of something like PSD2 is it's a rip the Band-Aid off fast approach, which is it is painful, but it gets normalized a lot more quickly than if we were to try and do it slowly over 2 to 5 years, or just encourage companies to adopt it. By putting that stake in the ground from a regulatory perspective, it is absolutely a headache for the banks, for the merchants, and for the consumers. But it does compress the pain a little bit to a point in time. So
just jumping in here, Tyler Sonic here again with My Commerce. So I've been watching this PSD2 impact on our business specifically, and just what I wanted to just comment it on, because I see everything at a high level, is when this rolled out at the top of the year, banks are obviously need to catch up, exactly the story that Chris talked about, with getting their customers' contact information updated in their systems. But that doesn't necessarily go hand in hand with this new initiative. So as we launched this initiative, banks, may not be able to receive a successful challenge from customers, and they acknowledge that, and that way we can still go and successfully authorize a transaction, even if it came back with a declined challenge. But as we see banks get more up to date, getting live with this new mandate and getting their customer base more prepared for it, that will slowly shift, where we will no longer be able to get an authorization if the challenge is declined. But I don't expect that to happen until their challenge success rates start to increase higher than what they currently are in the industry.
Mm-hmm. Makes sense.
And Bogdan, one more thing. You got to keep in mind that in Europe, it's going to roll out throughout the European Union. It will become the cultural norm, you see?
Right.
So, yes, at first, if you're going to lose some, right?
Yeah.
But over time, after they go to one card and another card and another card, it becomes the culture. You see my point?
Sure.
Right.
Yeah, makes sense.
Yeah. And I never heard of any plans of that being rolled out in the United States. So, so far.
All right. Well, I think with that, Chris, I think you were done, right? This was interesting.
Yeah,
final
that was
discussion.
good, Chris. Thank you.
No, I am complete. Thank you very much. I appreciate you giving us the opportunity. Thank you.
No, and we appreciate you taking the time to put this together. I know this was, it took time, right? We had to kind of, take you away from your regular day job to do this. So really appreciate it. And for anybody still on the chat, on the call, feel free to I reach out, I guess, either to Chris or Tyler, and or even us, we'll connect you, and be sure that you let them know CleanApps sent you, so that you want to keep doing more of these in the future.